I grew up in a rural community. All my friends and anything fun, really, meant a 30-minute drive into town. However, that doesn't mean that nothing was close. In the next town over, population under 10,000, there were the usual suspects. Grocery store, couple of banks across the street from each other, and a Corners. I don't know if you have a Corners where you live, but I'll describe it to you. They're fairly tall for no good reason that I can think of and have big windowed fronts so you can see all the merchandise inside. As for the merchandise, think of it as a dollar store that never felt obligated to stick at $1. Nothing too expensive, no televisions or appliances or anything, definitely no produce, but just about everything else. It's the kind of place you'd go with your allowance money as a kid to pick out something fun, like a $5 movie or a package of cookies. Corners is famous for its unusually large quantity of paper towels they keep stacked up at the door, as if they're showing off. Nobody thinks about Corners, and that's by design. You're not supposed to think too hard about it. Its purpose is just supposed to be obvious. Everyone knows what they're getting into, even if they've never been to one. They know what to expect. I believe my Corners location is alive. Let me explain. I was 17 at the time. Me and some friends just got off school and we were planning to go on a campout. My friend Bryce had some land that his father leased out for cattle ranching, but all the cows had been moved, freeing us up to go out and do whatever we wanted. You can bet that we had managed to smuggle as much in as possible that our parents might not be all too keen on us having. We had been sold several cases of beer, and Kyler secured about $50 worth of weed. "Hey," I told Bryce, nudging him in the shoulder. "Who got the hot dogs? I don't see a cooler or anything." "What, you gonna be pissy without hot dogs?" asked Sawyer. "Homo?" I groaned. I felt like the most mature one of the group, which meant that I had the least patience or fun. "Your mom's a homo." "No, your mom's a homo." "Which one?" I asked, a smug smile on my face. The truck erupted in a roar. Apparently, any variation on the non-joke after 10 million instances of it being told makes for comedy gold. "But seriously, we gotta get snacks. Who brought snacks?" Everyone was quiet for a second or two. "I'm getting nothing," said Kyler. "I spent enough money." Everyone kept passing the responsibility like a hot potato until it got back to me. Being the only one of my friends with a job, it made sense that I buy the snacks. And you know what that means? Corners. The 5 of us stopped at the Corners store and got out. We went inside and immediately bolted for the snack section. Seeing as they weren't the ones paying, they went all out, grabbing as many Oreos and Nutter Butters as humanly conceivable. I shot them a glare, but they didn't seem to mind. I could tell they assumed that since I was the only one with any college plans, they could keep abusing my money for the rest of their lives. After all, Bryce couldn't keep mooching off his parents, and Kyler couldn't keep mooching off his girlfriend forever. As they were stacking up boxes of snacks to the moon, I popped over to the instant coffee section. I knew we were going to need it in the morning after the campout. As I perused, I couldn't help but notice a strange buzzing noise. I thought it was the fluorescent lights at first, but as I leaned in, I realized it was coming from the shelf. I put out a hand to feel it, and sure enough, something was buzzing inside the steel. I couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. I figured it must have been something electrical. It was the rhythm that bothered me the most, however. It reminded me so much of a heartbeat. Thud-thud, thud-thud, thud-thud. "Hey guys, check this out," I called out. They came over to my aisle, confused as to what I was doing. "You got yourself a shelf lady friend?" asked Sawyer. "Gonna love her up so we can see?" "Shut up," I hissed. "I'm trying to figure out what this is." "It's a shelf, dude," replied Bryce. "Hey!" shouted the woman behind the counter. She had been ignoring us to read a magazine for the duration of our visit, but now we had her full attention, and she looked pissed. "Get off that!" I let my hand off the shelf. Sorry, ma'am." Within a moment, she was back to her magazine. I figured she just didn't want stupid kids messing with anything inside the store. We laughed it off and decided to check out, and the cost felt like someone took an ice cream scoop to my flesh. It's amazing how expensive lots of cheap things can be. Anyway, that evening we managed to get a fire going out on Bryce's property. It took a little time, and collecting the wood was a chore, but it was very satisfying once it was complete. Everyone was laughing and having a great time, but I didn't have any beer. I had just been quietly sipping a Coke and eating a bag of chips. "Yo, you a teetotaler?" asked Sawyer. "Nah," I replied. "Just thinking about driving back to Corners." "How come?" asked Kyler. "I want to figure out what that weird buzzing was. It felt wrong, you know? I'm just curious." Everyone was far too out of it to properly respond. I knew I'd probably be alone for the next 30 minutes, and I didn't really care. I didn't really feel like I belonged in this group anyway. We'd been friends since elementary school, but, you know, the older you get, the more you drift apart, right? Not that I thought I was any better than them. Honestly, I felt awful that I wasn't as fast about laughing as they were. I just sort of stood there, awkwardly smiling, being the butt of that every joke I wasn't fast enough to get. That's probably the only reason they let me come, that and my money. But I really genuinely wish that I could have been a real friend to them. But that's just not me. My parents always told me I'd come into my own in college. I hoped that was true. I got back into my truck and headed to Corners. The sun was setting and the store would be closing soon, but not too soon. I walked in and the woman behind the desk looked up, just a touch from her magazine, to glare at me. I only barely noticed out of my peripheral vision. I walked back over to the coffee section, knelt down, and put my hand on the back of the shelf. There it was again, the weird, pulsating feeling. It might have just been the way the steel was textured, but it was leathery, like a tanned hide. I had begun to scratch the steel with my fingernail to see what it did. "Hey!" shouted the woman behind the desk. "What are you doing, kid?" "Just browsing," I answered, continuing to do it. I figured if she was really pissed off enough, she'd come back and do something about it. But she never did. She just kept yelling at me. I tuned her out and kept scratching, eventually realizing something odd. The scratches had begun to peel a little bit, revealing some residue underneath. I couldn't figure out what kind of material would have produced this, but it wasn't steel. Eventually, she stopped complaining, resuming her magazine. The strange pulsing was getting stronger. I kept going at it, thoroughly enthralled with the buzzing experience, until it finally happened. I saw a drop of blood. A woman stood next to me. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm going to need you to come with me." I looked up to notice the woman from behind the desk, standing not too far away from me. However, my attention was drawn to the strange cord-like growth that stretched from her lower thigh out across the building into the employees-only section. Ma'am?" I asked. "If it's all right, why do—" She grabbed my arm, tightly. Pulling me to my feet, she had begun to walk over to the entrance to the employees-only section. Confused and unsure what to do, I surprised her by running past her a little ways, jumping and stomping heel first into the hose. The force of my sneakers on the hose caused it to bruise a bit, and the woman let go of me, her skin immediately turning purple. It was at that point my little expedition needed to come to an end. I bolted for the door, immediately trying to open it as hard as I could. It was locked. I've never attempted to force a door open as hard as I did then, but nothing worked. I could tell she was coming up on me, and I could feel the pulse in the door handle, albeit that could have been my own pulse too. Fortunately, my friends and I were something of fire players. We had gotten our hands on a set of flare guns each, since they're fairly easy to get and they don't track them like they do firearms. It's only a few dollars per pop, and it's a great self-defense tool. I'd picked up a set to defend myself in the parking lot of work after dark in case anyone had gotten any funny ideas about my tip cache. I still had it on me, fortunately, and decided now was the time to use it. I only had one flare, though. Would it have been better to use it on the woman or the door? I had no idea what it would do to either, so I used it on the door. I heard a horrible screaming noise coming from the employees section as the door unlocked in pain. I threw myself out and ran to my truck as fast as I could, turning it on and speeding off back to the campsite. None of my friends believed me. Kyler thought I had just been stoned out of my mind and got angry at me for taking so much weed. But when I pointed out that I clearly hadn't taken any out of the bag, he was too stoned to care. They thought it was a cool story, though, made a couple of jokes about it, and got back to goofing off around the campfire. I'm coming to Reddit to share my experience. Has anyone else been to a Corners before and noticed a pulse? They're probably a local chain, so I can't imagine they're common elsewhere. I'm a little suspicious, and I know this sounds crazy, but you know how mushrooms and mycelium work? I can't help but wonder if all these stores are somehow connected underground, and they use these locations as a front for foot traffic. That's just my theory, though. It could be really anything. I was the only human in that store that night, I can assure you of that. I can't rest, though. I'm going back. I'm going to be a little more prepared this time, but I have to know the truth.